Hi, I'm Todd Rundgren, and I'm standing in the lobby of the gorgeous Akron Civic Center, a location from which we are going to world premiere A Wizard of True Star. A lot of people have questions about why this particular record after 36 some years. I'm going to tell you why. All of the records that I made up until A Wizard of True Star were recorded in independent studios in California and sometimes in New York. Pretty much exclusively a studio in California called ID Sound, and some work at a relatively new studio called The Record Plant in New York. After Something Anything and the success thereof, I was being tagged as some sort of singer-songwriter, and the expectation was that I would continue to fulfill that role, and I was often referred to as the male Carole King. And while I had no animus to Carole King, the idea of me being just a singer-songwriter was not comforting to me in terms of what I was hoping to create as a musical legacy. And I realized that I've been doing a lot of things out of habit. I've been going to the same studio out of habit. I'd been recording these albums of 3 or 4 minute songs in the same manner that most everyone else did, and had never stopped to consider other possibilities. And after the success of Something Anything, I thought, here's an opportunity to kind of redefine myself in terms that I felt a little more comfortable with. And to do that, I felt I had to, as well as taking a new look at the musical part of it, I wanted to create a different sort of work environment so that I wouldn't be watching the clock, and I wouldn't be necessarily limited by the kinds of equipment that was in that studio. I could get other oddments and things that gave me the sounds that I imagined. And so I set about to build a studio in New York. It was called Secret Sound. I partnered with a friend of mine, Mookie Klingman at the time, and he had the space and I bought the equipment. And we essentially did it like, Little Rascals project. We would, none of us were professional carpenters, none of us were electronics experts or anything like that. We just started doing it. We started throwing up 2x4s and built a control room and built a drum booth and moved the equipment in. I built the console from scratch myself, wired up the whole thing pretty much myself, and then at a certain point we felt we were far enough along that we could start doing sessions. So we called the session, and the day that session began, which was, I believe, Sometimes I Don't Know What to Feel, one of the songs from A Wizard of True Star, musicians were setting up and practicing while I was still on my back underneath the console trying to wire everything together. We've got 11 channels working. Oh, we got 12 channels working. Right now we got 14 channels working. We can record now. So it was an extremely organic process in that sense, and it sort of reinforced this this idea of not accepting the kinds of rules and routines that that records were normally made by, and it created more of kind of like a little musicians commune around the studio. Lots of players would come in and do projects of their own, and many of those players then became the musicians on A Wizard of True Star, and eventually musicians in the early versions of Utopia. So the idea of having a studio of my own paid back, not just in terms of making the record that I wanted to make, but it created a whole sort of foundation for a musical collective, I suppose, out of which came Utopia and a number of other things. So in the end, it was, I guess, a revolutionary era for me, because I never went back, more or less, to recording in in independent or commercial studios. From that point on, I always had a studio of my own, and all of my records were pretty much made in my own environments. I still continue to produce other people and would do those in whatever studio seemed appropriate to that. But a lot of work, even from, for instance, the first Meatloaf album, Bat Out of Hell. We did a lot of the vocal overdubs in my studio. My studio just wasn't big enough to hold all the players for the basic recordings, but we eventually wound up there and I mixed it there. The evolution from Something Anything to A Wizard, a True Star, to me, was actually very sort of organic and necessary, and not necessarily out of character. A lot of people will attribute the change that came over me, as it were, as being substantially due to my experiments with psychedelic drugs. But that is often sort of overemphasized. We never recorded under the influence of psychedelic drugs, at least. A lot of people have forgotten that my first solo album was a fairly eclectic piece of work. There were a lot of different types of music, and I invited a lot of different musicians to help me create it. And it was similarly received with some trepidation in in the world of music. It did have a hit single off of it, but it was an uncharacteristic song. It was not like a lot of the other stuff on the record. And that has always been a problem for me. I make records that are probably more varietal than what the public at large assumes from the few singles that make it to the radio. And I've always felt that I had some sort of musical destiny that didn't necessarily include, incredible commercial or success or widespread popularity. It was always a musical objective that I was trying to achieve, and I wasn't making the music to increase my worth as a performer or personality. And so I would often, have some success. I'd release a record that was accessible, let's say, to people, or fit the forms that they were used to. And then I would immediately follow up with something else, simply because my mind had wandered off from the thing I was doing. Or, for instance, I would take a record like The Hermit of Mink Hollow and decide, okay, I'm going to do something that is a collection of highly refined pop songs. But to me, that's not an attempt to be commercial. That's just a concept. Can I do this? Can I pull this off in any way? And once I've done it, I feel the necessity to do it again, which is why the record after A Wizard, a True Star was even a further evolution. It went back to the idea of songs with spaces in between them, unlike A Wizard, a True Star, which is a long sort of patchwork of musical ideas. But the songs themselves had changed form and began to incorporate other sorts of modalities, other sorts of instrumentation. A Wizard, a True Star was probably the first time that I started to apply synthesizers in a serious manner. And that was because they were becoming more affordable and accessible. Synthesizers now were built into keyboards, whereas the very first synthesizer I bought was a sort of a standalone thing, and you had to buy a keyboard separately to make it play notes. And so A Wizard, a True Star was my first opportunity to really incorporate a lot of the unusual sounds that these instruments could create, sometimes in a musical context, sometimes in a I would say more textural way. They were not really playing notes and melodies, but they're creating sonic textures to embellish the songs. And I became sort of known for my application of the synthesizer in music, and some people enjoyed it and some people complained about it because it was something that was new and unfamiliar. And that's pretty much just the way my history has gone. I'll do something, my fans will become accustomed to it or inured to it in a way, and as soon as that happens, I wind up doing something else. But it's the reason I believe that I still have a loyal fan base, is that I try and make it interesting for everybody. You know, it keeps us young. It keeps us all young because we never know what's going to happen next.